Called one of the world's reigning strategy gurus by the Academy of International Business, Michael Enright is a leading expert on competitiveness, regional economic integration, and international business strategy. He also directs the Asia-Pacific Competitiveness Program at the Hong Kong Institute of Economics and Business Strategy. He joins us now from our Cape Town studios. Michael, thank you so much for coming onto the program. How does intervening in the economy, at a regional level differ from that of interventions at very local or national economic development levels?
Well, at the national level, national governments typically focus on issues of macroeconomics, monetary policy, fiscal policy, international trade relations, investment programs and policies, and these are the things that they have to do. At the very local level, particularly, say, at the city level, you tend to see an emphasis on housing issues, urban transportation issues, dealing with utilities, providing services in fringe areas. And at the regional level, what we see is that it's possible to sort of put aside some of the macro issues, put aside some of the very local issues, and focus really on how firms develop, how industries develop, how complete supply chains develop, how clusters of firms and industries develop. Because what we find is that that process usually goes on at a regional scope rather than a national scope or a very local scope.
Mm-hmm. Now, Nigel, of course, the question of economic policy is a very contested question at the moment, particularly if you look at the global crisis in your financial markets and the capitalism in general with the Eurozone and so forth. How does intervening in the economy differ from other public policy areas, given the fact that, economics is not an exact science?
No, I think recent history has shown how inexact economics is. And while the capitalist system that we have at present certainly has been called into question, I don't think anyone has come up with a better one as of yet. I think the key that we're talking about is how governments at national, regional, local level can set a playing field, set the rules of the game that allow firms to operate, regulating to ensure that social requirements are met without stifling innovation and growth, by providing the public goods, providing sufficient education, infrastructure in order for business to progress. But we often find that that's maybe not quite enough, that sometimes what we need is government to get involved in identifying what industries, what clusters of industries are present in an environment, what some of the obstacles are, how both public and private sector can coordinate to try to overcome common issues and solve common problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, Michael, one of the big challenges is, of course, to get politicians and private sector, industrialists to come to a common understanding of what is required, for economic growth, particularly in developing countries. And if you look at the African continent, what are the kind of instruments that one needs to bring greater synergy between government planning and the kind of outlook and perspectives within the private sector?
Well, what we need in that regard are basically forums in which the public sector and the private sector can interact, and hopefully forums that are in a sense neutral, that allow perhaps some of the politics and posturing to be left at the door. In fact, this week I'm in Cape Town to participate in a program on leadership and regional development that's being put on by the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Development Policy and Practice. And what we find is that that type of setting, a university setting, a neutral setting, can really bring together people from different levels of government and also from government and the private sector in a sort of non-confrontational way to explore what the common issues are, what the common problems are.
Mm-hmm. Now, often leadership as a variable is considered probably the most important aspect of driving public policy, particularly economic policy. I'm not sure the extent to which you are familiar with South Africa's economic and political situation, but if one were to take South Africa as an example, do you believe that there's adequate leadership both in the corporate and private sector and in the political sector to develop a common approach to economic policy, given the challenges that the South African economy faces?
Well, this really, to my way of thinking, is yet to be seen. I think what we need to have here is sufficient understanding, sufficient analysis that sets what the facts are in terms of national development, regional development. What we need is information on best practice within South Africa, but also best practice internationally. And my experience in other nations has been that when one can establish the fact pattern, when one can identify the obstacles, when one can identify the bottlenecks, that what we tend to see happen is people rise to the occasion. And I think once we get understanding, dialogue, the appropriate interaction between public sector and public sector at different levels, between firms and between the public and private, that we'll see that type of leadership emerge.